Hey Ben, how you doing?
Yo, man, I'm good. Just I think I'm 20 blocks south of you, 40 blocks south. No, yeah, 40
Something like
blocks.
that,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm at the West Village. You're in. Is it Tech? It's
Hell's
still
Kitchen.
Hell's Kitchen, even though you moved.
I call it Hell's Kitchen. Otherwise, it's ambiguous as to what it is.
You're in Midtown, Times Square.
Yeah, it's
All
not
right,
that
all
sexy.
right, all right, all right. Well, cool, man. I'm excited for us to have our very first episode. We don't have a name for this. I think talked about basically like we call it like the future of subscription commerce or the nuts and bolts of subscription commerce. I think it would behoove
Yep.
us to give like a quick, call it, couple sentences around our backgrounds and expertise and credentials. Although I don't know if anyone beyond our moms and maybe our dads will be listening. So I
Hey, they'll be proud of us.
don't.
It's at least an update for them of what we've been doing
Right,
now.
right, right. Exactly. So I'll quickly go first. My
Sure.
name is Ben Fisher. I have been a entrepreneur, programmer, and designer building digital products for the last 12 to 15 or so years. Some of those products have built with Joel. Been longtime collaborators on stuff. Most recently, I co-founded CartHook about 6 years ago and left the business about 2.5 years ago. And so I'm working on exploring my next rodeo. The like my obsession has really been around the Shopify world and specifically subscription e-commerce and ways to help
Um,
brands increase their like tools to increase their average order value, repeat purchase. I'm really fascinated with helping high performing marketers and brands make more money. I love problem solving.
mhm.
I'll go to you.
I think that's what you and I have in common,
Yeah,
right? Is the problem solving.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my my background is going to be sound very similar. Been working in design, product, and technology for going on 20 years now. Starting as a designer, that's what got me more into kind of like the product mindset. But then I wanted to start building things as an entrepreneur, move faster, do my own thing for many years, and went from that into development. So I've played a CTO role quite a bit, particularly the last 6 years in e-commerce, um, focusing on D2C, direct to consumer, uh, specifically subscription, and really seeing the ups and downs of not just trying to grow a business like that, but seeing the evolution of the types of tools that have been available to direct to consumer businesses, seeing how those tools have evolved to cater to that kind of business model, and being part of the process, also trying to support and integrate a lot of that for direct to consumer. So, as Ben mentioned, I have been outside of the platform SaaS kind of uh, e-commerce provider ecosystem and more around open source like WooCommerce and build your own, roll your own kind of solutions, which has lent itself to teaching me quite a bit about the challenges when it comes to nuts and bolts of things.
And I think part of what's interesting to me, and part of I hope will make our conversations interesting, is that um, for you were early into subscription e-commerce, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
Freshly, Daily Harvest, as I mean, you started. I don't know how long ago was that when you first started building subscription e-commerce platforms.
Yeah, that was back in 2015. So there were, you know, some solutions out there to facilitate subscription, but honestly, it was, at least from my perspective, right?
Yeah,
Like the way I entered into that whole world was that there was this new thing, which was subscription. And maybe it was just for me, like direct to consumer as a business model was very new and exciting. And so I think, the technology solutions didn't exist. E-commerce was, more discovery focused and very transactional. And so, there were some things like I mentioned earlier, WooCommerce that was starting to get into subscription, but it was extremely early. And I happened to be working like you mentioned with Freshly, which grew extremely fast. And that's where you see, how much the technology has to support that growth. And at the time, it was way before its time.
Yeah, and so what was the platform, or was it on WooCommerce? Was it custom built?
Yeah. So when I got involved there, I'm trying to remember what e-commerce platform they were on. I don't remember what it was, but it
GeoCities?
was WooCommerce. Yeah, exactly. Some sort of unheard of kind of platform. Maybe it was Joomla
Uh-huh.
or some sort of CMS type of thing. I don't know, but um, I guess I shouldn't say that because WooCommerce is WordPress, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Switched over to that. Really, at the time, it was kind of looking at what are the solutions out there and which ones could we customize
Mm-hmm.
because the features that were needed for subscription just weren't available off the shelf. Um, so it was WordPress with WooCommerce. We chose that because WooCommerce at the time was, I think, the most popular, or at least the most popular off the shelf non SaaS e commerce platform. And they had the subscription plugin that had, I think, just come out at the time that kind of, in a sense, was indicating that this was starting to become a real thing. There is an official plugin, but it was very, very limited in terms of features. And, the challenges that the way I saw the challenges technically were really that WooCommerce was not built for the volume of orders that would happen every time subscriptions renewed,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that influx, those spikes of orders were really challenging to deal with, along with, the actual just growth of the business beyond that, infrastructure wise, supporting it and some other things that came along with using other people's plugins that are oftentimes generalized solutions, which I guess you get to some degree with Shopify too, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
maybe there's more and more specific apps these days, but I'm sure it started very generalized.
Yeah. No, that
Like what did you see? What have you seen with subscriptions or even just the app ecosystem on Shopify in comparison to open source?
I mean, it's interesting. I think the criticism today, understandably, is that on one hand, the positive is that Shopify has a thriving app ecosystem. That was like one of the early. That was one of the big reasons that Shopify has been able to be so successful. Was they didn't have to build or take into account all of the nuanced use cases. They were able to enable third-party developers to build apps to fill in the gaps. They were able to layer in like the initial like base functionality and then let apps fill in the more complicated use cases. I think, but the criticism now, understandably, is someone might need or they need like 15 apps to run their business,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so, what was at one point an advantage, or yeah, it enabled people to do things that if they had relied on Shopify to build all that stuff, like it'd still be like I don't know. They'd be the platform would be so far from where it is today. But the
Yeah.
problem now is you have a lack of like interoperability, right, between these different apps. Where if you're running a subscription brand, and I'd say it's fairly political, but for the most part, two companies have existed to enable subscriptions in Shopify.
Within Shopify, yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
Bold and Recharge. I think what's interesting though is, so at least when I was at CartHook, we started off in cart abandonment, and Shopify wasn't really a platform on our radar. This is, I don't know if it's like 2015-ish too, ironically or coincidentally.
Yeah, I think it's right around the same time, probably.
And at the time, the first subscriptions I saw were on CrateJoy. So CrateJoy came out as a platform as like to build a box, right? And
Don't get me started on that experience with Cratejoy.
they were actually a great.
That was a nightmare
Oh
too.
my god! I mean, we built a custom integration for cart abandonment on CrateJoy, and CrateJoy ended up becoming one of our larger customers because they used Cart hooks, cart
You know
abandonment
what?
product. What?
I just remembered, yeah, because when I was working on the integration with Cratejoy, I contacted you
Right.
to help figure out that integration.
Yeah.
I was telling him, oh
Yeah.
yeah, I can Slack the founder
Yeah. Yeah.
over
Yeah.
here.
That's funny.
That was the early
Yeah.
days.
So that was
Yeah,
before even Shop. I mean, Shopify was on our radar, but it was one of, we'll call it like 7 platforms that we integrated with.
yeah,
We had
yeah,
originally, I think, our first integration was with like Volusion, and then we integrated with BigCommerce and
yeah.
Cratejoy, and then Shopify. And so, fast forward, subscriptions like Cratejoy was originally like the Build a Box thing. So I guess Birchbox had just come out. So you have all these like this
Yeah,
entire
that's
like
exactly right.
wave of Build a Box sample
Yep.
products, where either it's through Guilt Group or whomever, where it wasn't subscription commerce in the sense of what you see today. It was really sampling and discovery for subscription commerce. And
I would say
Cratejoy,
discovery is right, like with Cratejoy in particular. Yeah,
and if you wanted to do a subscription, Cratejoy was the only thing I was aware of to offer a subscription. And I do believe they specialized in the Build-A-Box use cases. Now, Recharge, as I recall, started off as an agency. I know that's true. And then they ended
right.
up
Yeah,
building this product for subscriptions, and it filled in the gap of what Shopify themselves did not support. And so for the last, call it 5 or 6 years, they have been the titans of industry. They have been and so
the dominator,
the
really.
dominator. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, I don't hear about too many people on Bold. Everyone's talking about
Yeah.
Recharge, but maybe it's because of their frustrations.
No,
They're
well, I
more
think
vocal
Bold.
about
I
it.
mean,
I don't know.
it's interesting because Bold has like Bold's subscription product is like one of like 25 apps they have. So Bold themselves also started as an agency, and so you have subscriptions were just one piece of Bold's business, whereas Recharge
Right.
focused exclusively on subscriptions, and so naturally, I think Recharge, by specializing, they really made a name for themselves in subscriptions. I don't know. I've met maybe one person on Bold subscriptions. I can't really speak. I can't speak to it, but Recharge
Yeah.
is the dominant player in subscriptions. I'm trying to remember what your actual question was. I feel like I just went down the road of the history of
That's right. I
subscription.
mean,
Um,
well, I mean, you touched on a couple things that are interesting and kind of tie into my own experience too. I was asking you how you saw the Shopify app ecosystem compare to the
Right.
open source,
Right.
but there's really you highlighted kind of the similarity between, in this case, in my case, with WooCommerce, WordPress,
Yeah.
which is all plugin related, and it's the same paradigm where they're basically little apps, and then the more you have installed, the less they really talk to each other, and you start having conflicting features, and that's, I think, where a lot of merchants and marketers start getting maybe a little more frustrated, right? Where they feel like, okay, now I've got 2 versions of the same feature, neither of them work well because they both don't talk to the third thing. But I want to go back to the Cratejoy example, and the reason being not just because of that coincidence where you and I got touch base at the time. It was actually thinking that this specialized subscription platform would be better than WooCommerce, right? I had done WooCommerce, I think, must have been at the time Freshly and Daily Harvest, and I had this other customer. It's okay, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do I don't want to do the off-the-shelf WooCommerce thing because it's just not stable enough. It's too challenging. This new guy, he looks like he knows what he's doing. It's specifically built for this, so on and so forth. And you really realize the limitations. I mean, this is true for any platform, but once you get into the nitty-gritty user experience aspects that we want to do, as well as some of the logistical and in some cases relate to that fulfillment constraints or needs that your business has, that you start running into flexibility issues, right? So in those early days, it was the calendar, right? Choosing your next subscription renewal date and things like that, and the cadence and the frequency frequency and so on and so forth, that was extremely hard to make user friendly. And, Cratejoy, I think, was the worst of it. It was so limited and kind of unintuitive. It was really built for what you said. It was like that sample box, right? It's the thing that you just get once a month. The timing doesn't really matter, just once a month, because it's like the thing you do with your kids or the thing you do to experience a new thing. But, there's obviously business models that aren't really just about discovery, but you want to get something at a certain time because you want to replenish something that you're getting on a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis. So when you run out of something, you want the next thing there at the right time. And that's where Cratejoy at the time was limiting, where it was very, very loose in how they thought about the timing of when customers would want their next order to come in.
Got it. No, it's interesting. And I don't know. I'm sure Cratejoy is still around, but I haven't heard much of anything, and it hasn't come up on my radar very much recently.
I do wonder. I do wonder if they've evolved it.
Yeah. But
they came out of Y Combinator, right? So I think they had a lot of firepower behind
it. Yes, that is accurate, and they're based in Austin, if my memory serves me. I think so. One of the interesting challenges, though, going back to the Shopify and your question around, so right now, part of the frustration is that subscriptions, up until fairly recently, were built outside of, we'll call it through the Wild Wild West, where basically there was no way to natively create to offer subscriptions on Shopify. That has changed, I think, as of November, and so you are seeing Shopify go down this direction of they are starting to provide some of the tooling themselves that they're not enabling you just to offer a subscription. You still have to use an app, right? And I think that's an important thing that a lot of people don't necessarily, unless you're technical, don't necessarily understand, is that you can't just go in and natively start offering subscriptions. Shopify, perhaps, maybe, I'm sure this is probably it's certainly a thoughtful move. I don't know whether or not it's the right move. I don't know, but they've really framed it more around there's going to be a lot of different types of ways that people will pay for things in the future over different payment terms, whether that's, and you can even look at things like Affirm, where it's you're able to pay over the course of time. There's
monthly installments for major purchases,
right?
Like Peloton,
right?
I did Peloton.
Yeah, no, and so they have approached subscriptions and would call it maybe in a very abstract way, which is you have the ability to create price rules or payment rules around what you sell, and that might include replenishment. It might not. It might be just 5 or 4 payments to buy the Peloton. Or it could be used for a subscription to buy, I don't know, jelly beans. I don't know. And so
it's almost as if they're just trying to get something into the market, right? Because they're not offering anything that is point and click. You have to get a developer involved. You have to, build an app, or for that matter, install an app that someone else built, which is really curious, right? Who are they marketing to, basically? Are they actually marketing to developers, or are they marketing to merchants? Because I think merchants might be getting confused about, okay, well, you've got it, but you don't really have it. So it's interesting to see how they're trying to get something out the door, and whether or not they're going to, have more out of the box at some point, or if it's just always going to be kind of like a headless solution.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's in flux. I'm on it. I think we're kind of in that awkward teenage stage where they're in puberty, and I honestly don't know. I think but what I have gleaned from just their general policies and what they've said about subscriptions and just we talk at post-purchase upsells and whatnot, is it's important to the platform to be able to provide native ways to integrate with that. And I do think part of that really does make a lot of sense from a design perspective, which is when you have 20 different apps, if a merchant's relying on 20 different apps, there has to be some sort of center, we'll call it contract, where you can where these different apps can interact with one another, and otherwise, like, it's chaos. But I mean, I think even still today, with brands relying on 6 different apps, the criticism is, and rightfully so, that the apps don't necessarily play with each other. And so if you're dealing with, like, Avalara with taxes, are maybe using I don't know, like ShipBop for shipping, you're using whatever. Like, it doesn't really matter, but there's a lot of the challenges that I hear from merchants is around getting products or getting the apps to interact with each other.
So do you think there's going to be something that can solve that? Is it something that Shopify has to drive? Is it something that, do you think it's going to be like an app consolidation to try and make that more streamlined?
I mean, I think there's a few different ways to approach it, and one of which is consolidation of apps around use cases, right? So rather than requiring 5 different apps, you end up designing apps for specific use cases. I mean, that's certainly one way.
When you say use cases, you mean like certain kind of business models or products, right?
Yeah, like I'm just trying to I'm trying to think, like, if you're running a business, and I'm trying not to be too abstract. I'm trying to come up with like I'm trying to be more concrete with examples, because otherwise I might lose people. But if it
pick on a brand.
if it requires 15 apps to run your business, how many of those, and some of those apps, part of your problem is that the apps aren't talking to each other. My guess is that in some of those apps where it's important for them to talk to each other, either there needs to be a more cohesive contract for integration through Shopify itself, so that you don't have that much pain, or maybe it's an opportunity for there to be a single app that does both those things. So that's we'll call it a native integration. I think where things get slightly dangerous is when the apps themselves. So right now the solution would be integrate with Shopify, and then the apps themselves maybe try to integrate directly as well, and that can work. But what you end up with is a web of integrations, some of which are through Shopify, some of which are app to app.
Roundabout.
And but the truth.
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say the app to app. I wonder how much Shopify cares about that from a policy perspective. Probably not too much. But you were with you working on Shopify with Carthook, and you're kind of saying open-endedly, what are the types of functionalities that maybe Shopify should have native, right? Were there some things that you guys experienced or saw that kind of killed a bunch of apps as they made that functionality native? Is that like a pattern, something that they would likely do?
I mean, every platform has that challenge. I think I remember going to Shopify Unite, and you're in this auditorium of people who built businesses and built apps, and you're sitting there. On one hand, you're super excited to find out what's the new stuff that's being released. On the other hand, you're like, are they going to natively release something that kills my business overnight? I can't think of any examples of businesses that got that were we'll say like outright killed by something that was announced. I think there's plenty of examples with Apple, though, or even maybe LinkedIn. More Apple. I think Apple's captures a similar
classic.
It's like everyone's excited. All the consumers are excited, but like if you're a vendor working with Apple or an app, if you have like a popular app, in the Apple App Store, you're also thinking, "Dear God, please don't take this in house."
Yeah, it's validation. It's a good idea, but it's not a good thing in that case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's funny? I think Test Pilot was an interesting example, right? Where Test Pilot started off as a third-party app where they basically, as I recall, used a roundabout way of using enterprise licensing so that you could get a bunch of different devices provisioned to use your app. Apple acquired them, I have not seen many acquisitions in the Shopify space of Shopify acquiring apps in the App Store. My guess is a big part of that is, and for any platform, you don't really. I don't know why necessarily, but my general observation is they don't want to establish that sort of expectation, because then it becomes
Yeah.
like, well, you didn't acquire my app and you killed my business. Or maybe there's more to it. I honestly don't know. We'd have to ask Shopify. Then maybe they don't even, maybe they don't even think about it. I have no idea. But I haven't seen any acquisitions of Shopify apps by Shopify themselves.
I wonder. Right. Yeah. I wonder how many of the apps on the Shopify ecosystem actually are providing a technology that is worth acquiring, versus something they can just easily build if they want to. My understanding is that particularly Shopify Core moves slow. They're very conservative at what they add, and that kind of a thing. So it could be that. It could also be like if they choose to do it, they will, versus acquiring. Whereas with Apple, I think, the types of apps or businesses they acquire are usually to make them more innovative. Whereas Shopify, maybe the type of incentive to acquire, in this case, not acquire apps, is different.
Well, my guess is if you're building upon Shopify APIs, they more or less see you as, well, technically we could do it. I think the acquisitions I recall they've done, one was around like shipping logistics or fulfillment logistics, right? So it wasn't
It's a hard problem to solve.
right? So it was more strategic around
Yep.
here are things that we currently don't have infrastructure in place with. And so doing this acquisition brings in, because otherwise it's just a matter of, if they wanted, they could build anything using their APIs.
Right.
It's just a matter of they've chosen to enable other people to build on those APIs up until the point where it somehow is in their best interest to build it natively. I don't really know how they think about it internally. I do know that from my conversations with like developer evangelists at Shopify, they have, at least the messaging internally has always been, we very much want and believe in having a thriving Shopify app ecosystem.
Yeah.
But I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. Envy the challenge of having to. On one hand, you're wanting, because early on they did rely on the app ecosystem to compete with these larger platforms, and then at a certain point, it's like if it's taking 15 apps to be able to accomplish something, and it's still not a great experience for the merchant or for shoppers, then at a certain point, it's like, well, what are you going to do? So I think going back to like just developing on Shopify and what's happening around subscriptions, I think part of my hope and part of what you and I have talked about doing, the reason we're recording this, is just talking about like what are some of the challenges around subscription commerce. The unique point of view that you and I both have on this, again, you coming from the, call it, outside of Shopify, having built all of this stuff yourself, and me coming from the Shopify world. We're both entrepreneurs. We both have built B2B SaaS companies, and so we come from like the technical side. And so this conversation is just you and me sort of jamming on our own nerdy technical point of view. In the future, I know we want to have like some operators come on and talk about some of the logistical challenges or strategies that have worked, or maybe even things they wish they could do but they can't. So I think this is almost like car talk, where we can be like, come bring your car and we'll try to tell you, debug what's wrong with your car, right? And we can give some advice around how to improve subscriptions on Shopify.
Problem solving, like you said earlier.
Because a lot of what we've been doing, both you and I, has been professional problem solvers and obsessed around subscription commerce, as well as just like what are ways to increase repeat purchase, make the experience of being a customer better, and and making all of it better, for lack of a better word.
Build back better.
build better. Just be better. Be better.
I
don't know. Is there anything that? Sorry.
No, I was going to say, it's great talking to merchants and marketers who are coming up with new ways to sell products, new technologies in terms of, call it headless or whatever you want. Like that app ecosystem is expanding beyond just a specific platform in the sense of like more and more services that marketers are creative about, or merchants for that matter, are creative about integrating with each other. So just observing not just the challenges, but the opportunities, I think is really interesting.
I guess one thing I'd be curious to ask you is, as someone who is historically, you've built on platforms, and then like, what's your current go-to? If you were to build a subscription commerce brand today, what would you do? What would be like your sort of like, what would you be thinking about? And maybe the answer involves, well, maybe it depends if you're going from revenue of 0 versus you have existing revenue of like $1 million or $10 million. And so then the question is really about replatforming or not. But I think that at least a lot of the conversations I have with merchants is questions around, do I upgrade to Shopify Plus? Do I stay on Shopify? And I think those are actually the more interesting questions. I think anyone starting to sell subscriptions today and they have 0 revenue, I would say just start with Shopify. Now, the challenge is, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm kind of answering the question that I asked you. But I'm thinking through really what's the question, and the question is less, I would say if a brand is doing several $1 million a year in recurring revenue on subscriptions, since you've grown several businesses up to that point, were you happy being on your own platform? And like, what were some of the trade-offs of doing that versus in hindsight where you're like, we should have just done this on Shopify? And I'm curious, are there certain circumstances where you're like, Shopify might have been a better solution, or Shopify definitely would not have been a better solution? And what were some of those reasons that might have pushed you one way or the other?
Yeah, those are good questions. I've kind of, because of building things custom, I've seen the entire spectrum of the business. And so like, for instance, fulfillment and logistics is an area that I've ended up really obviously learning a lot about, but understanding some of the nuances. And, when it comes to that piece of it, I obviously haven't worked that much on Shopify, or at least going back to when I started this path of building custom. I think there were very limited options there. Obviously no subscription option there either, right? So I think if I were to do it again, I might actually use Shopify. But in my experience previously, choosing not to use another platform, it's usually been around the scheduling and flexibility of kind of the frequency and the user experience around, optionality with when you want to get your order, if you want to get more orders, really the user or the customer facing control over the subscription, which I think to this day is still one of the challenging areas in terms of the existing platforms like Recharge and so on. So I think that's a good reason to build custom, as long as you don't have too many SKUs and you keep things as simple as possible in terms of business logic around pricing and discounts and shipping and all this kind of stuff. And I've been lucky enough in my experience to keep a lot of those features pretty simple. If you look at Shopify, they're trying to provide lots of different options in those areas because they're trying to support a lot of different business models. I've tended to stick with very similar ones that are around, CPG, food, frozen, that kind of a paradigm. I'm almost literally all that. And because of that, the logistical fulfillment side is the area that really needs a lot more control also over that scheduling and cadence of when the charges happen, orders are generated, and that kind of a thing. Going back to Cratejoy, just as a quick thing, that was the polar opposite, right? You could choose either the 1st of the month or the 14th of the month or some other kind of random day of the month to renew things, whereas a lot of businesses operate on a weekly basis, not a monthly basis. That's a key thing, is like, when do you actually have your warehouses stock up and create the product and ship it out, and how do you avoid weekends and things like that influence a lot of how I've built these subscription platforms until now. I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it leads to more questions, because I'm sure there's a lot of examples
Sure.
around. Because I would guess the flip side of this is you are kind of reinventing the wheel a lot, right? So I am curious, are there third-party integrations you guys are using? Like, are you, like, for example, with like a CMS, are you using something like Contentful, or are you using like an open source package on? Because I believe you guys are built on Rails, at least some of your work. Yeah.
Ruby on Rails or Node or PHP with the WordPress stack.
Mm-hmm.
Those are typically the backends. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. It's like, how do you isolate the part to make custom, and how do you outsource, in a sense, other things? And I think, taxes or Avalara or TaxJar. Managing shipments is ShipStation, that kind of a tool. A lot of customer-facing functionality like loyalty programs or referral programs, or even, in some cases, trying to intercept pause or cancel flows, or even trying to set up pause or cancel flows. There's third parties that will try and incentivize customers to stay subscribed or upgrade or downgrade and that kind of thing. So yeah, there's a lot of things there kind of round about the actual, scheduling and ultimately the billing cycle. And I guess I mentioned before the fulfillment piece of it. But yeah, so like, I actually defer to integrating with as many things as I can to offset any kind of development cost or investment at early stages, at least. It does limit, the types of discounts you can create, or at least early on, right? There's a lot of things like free shipping at a certain threshold, or combining different products and then you get this free or that discount or whatever. And, there you end up keeping it simple. And in many cases, you develop a discipline for how to use the limited number of promotions you can. And usually it's not something that limits the business. It's just kind of rethinking the strategy a little bit, until you get to a point where you really have an opportunity to try something new, and then you invest in improving those kinds of features.
Got it. Well, and I think and maybe some of this we can even leave for future episodes, but I was going to say one last thought I was going to leave with you, or us, and all of our listeners, all of our loyal listeners.
Our audience.
Although I think by definition everyone is loyal, because everyone has listened to it for as many episodes as we have, which is one. So if you've gotten this far into our episode, you are one of our most loyal. You're one of our loyalist listeners.
Congratulations!
Right?
You've listened to our entire podcast series.
But what's interesting is, for all the businesses where you've built the platform, the brand took like most of the brand, we'll call it modern D2C brands today, like they're brands. So they might, and after leaving CartHook, I was effectively like a fractional CTO for a number of subscription e-commerce brands, both on Shopify as well as off, like custom. And in most situations, these brands will have someone technical on their team, maybe a junior developer or one developer, but they're not a tech company. And I think you and I have had conversations around this. Like, the truth is, as far as I understand it, businesses, CPG brands, are not like building a tech resource in-house because it improves their valuation or their resale value, right?
Right.
So I would say the argument for using a platform, whether it's Shopify or something else, is, man, you're not going to be able to sell for a higher multiple simply because you built your own stack. The reason people are hiring or building out entire tech teams in house, like in your cases, I would assume is because the platforms themselves aren't flexible enough to enable you to build the business you need in order to have a successful company that you can resell, right? So it's more a matter of they're investing in building kind of like WeWork. WeWork tried to position themselves as a tech company where they're really a real estate business,
Right.
just because they had programmers.
Yeah.
These D2C brands are not a tech company. They are like a CPG brand with engineers, in part because for whatever reason, whether they think it'll enable them to get to build a better product or better business faster. But in an ideal world, they should be focusing on building their audience, dealing with their supply chain issues, not dealing with the tech. And the only reason that they're hiring engineers is because technology keeps getting in the way.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're absolutely right. Right. Most of these businesses are valued based on the product they sell, not the technology. I think, in some cases, maybe there's strategic alignment with investors or other partners or merchants or whatever, that there is value in building that tech. Maybe there's a slightly different business model where there's, again, the next frontier that just isn't facilitated by existing platforms that there's an opportunity we don't know about. But, I think the trend is typically, like you said, leverage what's out there to get the business going, build up that customer base, optimize in all the other areas of the business. And then I think some businesses get to a point where they do want to optimize on the technology costs, whether it's, like you mentioned before, you might have 15 or 20 different apps. Well, they're all charging, some sort of fee, maybe even a percentage. And you might look at the economics and say, well, you know what, based on what we need, it could be cheaper for us to build our own thing here or there, or replace the whole thing entirely. And that's where you get into, like, is it even custom code, or is it just moving to like a self-hosted platform or something like that, which you didn't build it, but you still have that technology responsibility that you have to maintain it. So I think I would say the smarter, but the more likely scenario is that you grow to the size where, from a cost perspective, it just makes sense. Might be a pain in the ass, but it makes sense. And I'll say too, reiterate that in my experience, the custom platforms we built were because at the time, off the shelf or SaaS just wasn't mature enough. Now I think, depending on the case, I might still build something custom, but probably leverage Shopify or something along those lines for the boilerplate function.
Cool. Well, I'd say this was a lot of fun, Joel. I think you and I have committed to doing this every week. And so going forward, we'd love to bring on operators of subscription e-commerce brands. Bring us your problems. Bring us your hopes and dreams. We'll help to whatever extent we can. I think if you are listening to this and there's any topics that you'd like for us to talk about, or if you have any opinions, and hell, if you disagree with anything we said, tweet at us. My Twitter handle is at skinny and bald, because I'm kind of skinny, kind of bald. So, Joel, you're Joel VH, I think.
I'm at Joel VH. At Joel VH.
Yeah, the letter V. But yeah, no, tweet at us if you have any thoughts or topics you'd like for us to talk about. I think we'd like to keep it around not just subscription commerce, but also just like ways to increase repeat purchase, increase lifetime
value, retention, average order value, all those acronyms that everyone is trying to focus on and figure out the right tools. We're obviously never going to know every single tool that's out there, and I'm sure there's a lot of really innovative solutions at the forefront. So finding out about those through discussions, sharing war stories would be awesome.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that yeah, and having real examples, we can speak to the companies that we've worked with and the customers and brands we've worked with. But if you have specific things that you've tried and have worked really well, and you know, or come on, talk to us. We'd love to understand and learn and hear what you're doing and how it's working. So until next time,
Talk to you soon.
Take care.